Anything that we do, we have to eventually talk about school funding and accountability. Many of the issues that we've heard talked about earlier today all focus around the issue of having appropriate funding, whether it's hiring and keeping teachers, having the programs we need in the schools, the resources for pre-K, for K through 3, teacher assistants, whatever it is, we get back to the funding. And so one of the goals today that we had in terms of educating and informing our public and engaging our public is to have information about this. And so I think the folks that we have here today have some really, really good information to share. Now, I told them I appreciate them coming after lunch. There's lots of caffeine in the back. You know, get more caffeine. It works for me. So I appreciate them doing this. And one thing I wanted to say is that we are taping the entire conference. So even though we've not able to keep everyone here this afternoon, the good news is that we will be able to have this on our website soon, and so that we can share with others who weren't able to be here today across the state a lot of this information. So that's really good. And this morning, WRAL live streamed the legislative panel and the keynote speaker. So we'll be able to pick that up later on WRALTV.com, okay? So now I'm going to move on, and we are really thrilled. We have to have Mike Ward here to be our moderator today. We just like to have Mike Ward around. We don't care what he's doing. We like to have him in the house because we know that we have a lifelong friend of education in the room when he's here. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what he has done, but you know he was our former superintendent for public instruction for many years, and he ran away to support his wife and her opportunity to expand in her career, which was always made me so proud of you, Mike, that you did that. And so he's here today. He's doing a lot of work with the MEWs Education Consulting, and he's going to moderate today. And all of these folks who are here at this table are good friends of his, so he'll be able to keep them in check, I'm sure. So thank you, Dr. Ward. Appreciate you very much.
Thanks, Yvonne. It is good to be home. And I'm so pleased to have a chance to join you for this discussion this afternoon. We've got a great panel, and the very idea that you would need caffeine to keep folks, to keep people's attention riveted on a study of finance, to me is just so contrary to logic. Yvonne mentioned that we left for a while. In 2004, my wife Hope became a United Methodist bishop, and I was wrapping up my second term as state superintendent, and we knew if she became a bishop that we would have to leave home because they don't let bishops start at home. They don't let bishops start at home for some of the same reasons that they don't let state troopers start at home. But in any event, that took us to Mississippi for 8 years. And so we were in Mississippi from 2004 to 2012. While there, I became a member of one of the world's smallest fraternities, Bishops' Husbands. Hope was only the second woman elected as a bishop in the southeastern United States. There are now 3. So we've got enough in our organization of Bishops' Husbands to elect officers and appoint committee. While bishops can't start at home, they can return home. It turns out they can return home. So in 2012, summer 2012, she was appointed to be bishop for the eastern half of North Carolina. We came home in the summer of 2012 to find that things had changed. Fiscally speaking, and in terms of education policy, we found that things had changed remarkably. What did y'all do? It was remarkably different, dramatically different. In fact, the only positive thing that I can say about the return from Mississippi in 2012, after years of steady progress in school resourcing and performance, to come back to a place where we had slipped to 48th in the nation in terms of commitment to resources for our public schools was just really alarming. The only positive thing I can say about that is it made the transition from Mississippi's education policy environment to North Carolina's education policy environment a little less dramatic, a little less abrupt. Lest you think that any of these reflections are partisan, let me remind us, and it's important to think about this, that the slide from where we were to where we are is one that began under a different administration. It began with a different legislative majority, but we're in better economic times now. This is a different day economically. And policymakers are accountable for their actions during the time that's allotted to them by voters. We have better economic times. We can do better by our public schools, fiscally speaking. Here to help us understand a little better that economic picture, how we resource schools, is a terrific panel, and I'm pleased to introduce them to you. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically, and then I'm going to call on them in reverse order. So I'm going to start with Ricky Lopes. Ricky is immediately to my right. Ricky has served as the Associate Superintendent of the Cumberland County Schools since 1990. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration with a concentration in accounting from East Carolina University. He's a licensed CPA. He's past president and member of the North Carolina Association of School Business Officials. He's a past president and member of the North Carolina Association of School Administrators. He's also a member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the North Carolina Association of Certified Public Accountants, and a past director for the Southeastern Association of School Business Officials. Ricky was the multi-year recipient of the Award for Financial Excellence in Reporting from the Association of School Business Officials International. He also received the Public Schools of North Carolina Recognition of Achievement Award. In terms of stewardship at the local level for public school dollars, they just don't get any better than Ricky Lopes. Keith Poston is President and Executive Director of the Public School Forum of North Carolina, an organization that has tracked how we make use of public education dollars for a number of years. Their analysis is incredible, and it provides really useful insights into public school resourcing and in real insights into equity issues around public school resourcing as well. Before joining the Public School Forum in January of 2014, Keith was Senior Director of Community Investment for Time Warner Cable. In that role, he was responsible for developing and implementing programs to promote science, technology, engineering, and math education as part of the company's primary philanthropic initiative, which is Connect 1,000,000 Minds. As Director of Communications for Time Warner Cable, he developed more than a dozen new regional and statewide partnerships to support STEM education, including initiatives with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, NC Science Festival, NC Science and Engineering Fair, Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center, North Carolina Science Olympiad. Keith is a Leadership North Carolina graduate and received the 40 Under 40 Leadership Award in 2004 from the Triangle Business Journal. Join me in welcoming Keith Poston. Philip Price and I worked together for a number of years. Philip says grace over a huge portion of public dollars because he serves as the Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Public Instruction, saying grace over billions of dollars that flow into the public schools of North Carolina, and does so with great professionalism, great expertise. Philip has been the Chief Financial Officer with the Department of Public Instruction since 2002. The agency technology services operations were transferred to his area in 2011. He joined the department in 1978 and has worked in various capacities within the accounting operations, including Director of School Business until December of 1999. In 1999, he left the Department of Public Instruction for a stint with the fiscal research staff of the North Carolina General Assembly, so he understands funding from a legislative perspective as well. And there he continued to concentrate his work on public schools. He returned to DPI in 2002, as we've noted. He's a graduate of North Carolina State University with a degree in accounting and a degree in economics. Please join me in welcoming Philip Price. And we're going to let Philip lead things off by giving us a statewide perspective on public school funding.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. There's a handout out there that included a few, I thought, key pages out of the highlights for the public schools, which we keep on our webpage. The point of the handouts, if you don't have a copy of them, raise your hand. I'm sure somebody will be able to help you get a copy of those. It's just trying to give you a kind of an overview of how funding is done in public schools. You might already know these things, but I wanted to make it exciting, as Dr. Ward said. Funding is often not considered as exciting as this is going to be. So, public schools in North Carolina are funded in 3 ways. Primarily, position allotments, as is described on this particular page. What that means is we do not give dollars to Cumberland County or to school districts. We give positions. With those positions, school districts are able to hire someone with 0 years of experience or someone with 30 years of experience in national board certification. The salary is guaranteed and the benefits. So there are slots, not money. And that's the major driver of the state budget. That is very different from any other state's funding model. In fact, it could argue that Hawaii has one similar, but Hawaii is one school district, so it's probably not a good example. But as a state, we're the only ones that have that kind of funding stream. Dollar allotments. Dollar allotments is where the school districts get a lump sum of money. They have to live within that lump sum of money. So that is just like your salary. It's like your home budget. You get a certain amount of income and you live within that income. So they have to live within that line item budget for their ability to cover. Categorical allotments are a little different. All your funding is tied up in position allotments or dollar allotments, which are going to be listed on a further page when you start looking through the document. Categorical allotments are saying, we might not have given you enough money to meet the needs of those children with special needs. So therefore, there's an additional pot of money that goes out to try to focus in on that population or the limited English proficiency population. Also, several years ago, the General Assembly determined that some counties couldn't generate local money at the same level as the state. They created this thing called a low wealth supplemental allotment, which goes out to school districts to help make up that difference between what they should be able to generate locally and what the formula says they can. The categorical allotments are important because they go to school districts and they allow them to design programs that meet the particular needs of their communities. They're locally defined to address the populations in which that funding is supplemental to. So at-risk money goes out there as a pot of money that school districts use to try to help students that are not performing at grade level. The children with disabilities for the children, obviously, that need additional support and services. So those are the 3 major ways. If you leave with only that knowledge, you now understand pretty much how we fund public schools in North Carolina. The second page of the handout kind of puts in perspective again what is the major funding streams. What kind of money is coming to North Carolina? As this chart shows, I use the child nutrition excluded for most of my presentations, which shows we have 66% of the funding coming from the state. We used to be top in the country as far as percent of funding coming from the state. It has dropped over the period of time, and as the chart, the very verbiage at the top of the page, it indicates that we're now 3rd in the Southeast and 13th in the nation related to our percent of funding as coming from the state. And at the bottom, it shows how do we spend this money. And I think what's important to understand when you start talking about flexibility or you start talking about funding in general for public schools, 90% of the funds are spent on people. State funds, that is. In other words, the state money goes out to employ personnel, mostly. So when you start cutting state funding, or you need additional state funding, it does have a direct impact, either negatively or positively, on personnel in the state or employment. The next page is just meant to show you sort of a general overview of what kind of money we're talking about. And this outlines the funding that was in the current fiscal year that we're in. If you notice, one thing I do like to point out is that central office, which is the administration portion of the public school fund, is 1.15% of all the funding that goes out from the state. It's a very small percentage of what the LEAs need, and it's also a very small percentage of the state public school fund. if you add up those items that are under instructional personnel support and categorical, that totals around 94% of the money goes into those particular and specific allotments. So most of the driver of the state is in personnel and it's in instruction, which there's actually the constitutions and legislations related to that particular item. One thing I'd like to mention at this point in time is flexibility. School districts do have the authority to move money around quite effectively, but it's an important fact to know that you have to have availability to have real flexibility. Looking at my personal budget, I have so many bills, like I love credit and stuff of that nature, so I have a lot of credit cards to pay, bills to pay, I have rent or mortgages to pay, and afterwards I have something left over. School districts, as the next few charts are going to point out, have had a continuing decline in funding available since 2009 and an increase consistently of students available. So you have an increase in the number of people you're serving and a decrease in the amount of money available, which has led to a reduction in the number of people that can be in the school buildings with the students. And then and a reduction in available money that can be considered unavailable to use for flexibility. I imagine you will hear very clearly from my friend Ricky about that particular issue in just a second, about how that pinches their ability to really do anything. But yes, there is ability to move money around within the state public school fund, but my argument has always been if you don't have any money available to move around, it's really not like having any flexibility. And was I not supposed to give editorial comment? The next item in the handout is something I like to always put out there, because everybody tells me, with the lottery, why are you asking for more money? And I just like to point out that the lottery, while helpful to as a revenue stream to support public schools, is 3.4% of the total budget for the state public school fund, and not a large contributor per se to the total amount of general fund money necessary to support our public schools and our teaching and classroom instruction. I do have 3 charts that follow here that show a little bit of the change that has occurred, because it seemed that the presentation was how do we fund public schools and what has changed over recent times. One of the things you hear a lot about is teacher compensation. And there's a chart that says average teacher compensation it shows that how over time we have continued to break away from the state average. It's a graphic visual to show you how things have changed over the last several years, and as we continue to move away from the national average related to our teacher compensation. The next 2 charts are showing you a little bit of information about historical teachers versus students. There's a bar chart with a line on it. The first one says historical teacher and versus student counts. And what that chart shows is the line is the average daily membership, which is constantly increasing. And the bars are the teaching population associated with that. And if you'll notice, in 2008-9, we were actually operating with our teaching population at the same ratios as our student population, but that has been declining since that period of time. And finally, the chart that shows the change in funding, which is more dramatic, showing how average daily membership continues to increase. Our student population is going up while our funding continues per student, which is not something I ever endorse talking about as funding per student, but if you do narrow it down to that type of conversation, this chart shows how that's dramatically changed. Why it's difficult to, in conclusion, why it's difficult to discuss funding per student, I'll give you a reason. We guarantee salaries, which means if you have a school that has 15 teachers in it, and they're all with 5 years of experience, they're going to have a particular average salary divided by that student population, which is going to indicate a certain dollar per student. If you go right next door and they have a school with 15 teachers with 20 years of experience, that school is going to have a significantly higher dollar per student when you start comparing the two, when in fact they both had 15 teachers for their student population. So it's very difficult to look at this and you start comparing. But that's a general overview, a quick one. Usually I do this for 2.5 hours, but they didn't want that today. So, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Now we're going to hear from Keith.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here after lunch and on a beautiful day. I appreciate it. Mike, I didn't make the connection earlier that Bishop Ward was that you were the bishop's spouse. So I had the pleasure of hearing her preach a time or two, and I think you've done a good job of being a bishop's spouse. So thank you. This is. As Mike mentioned when we introduced me, this is the issue of school funding has been something that the Public School Forum has been studying, examining, exploring, shining a light on really since we opened our doors in 1986, because there is obviously a link between resources and what you're able to do and what students are able to achieve and the kind of investment you're able to make. And so the Public School Forum has been looking. We publish one study every year, and I didn't bring copies for everyone, but I encourage you, if you go to ncforum.org, we have a couple of studies. One is called the Local School Finance Study that comes out every year. We also have another one called the Roadmap of Need, which actually takes a deeper dive. It's a county index, and it doesn't just look at education spending, it also looks at other factors that affect student achievement, including everything from poverty to third grade reading level, to obesity, to single parent homes. So a lot of those factors. Now I'm not, it's interesting to me to be on a panel about finance surrounded by these financial guys and numbers guys. I'm sure that, so I was telling Ricky, I'm a native of Cumberland County schools, Cumberland County and Fayetteville. I went to school there. I'm sure my junior high school math teacher, Ms. Horton, would chuckle that I was on a panel talking about numbers. But Ricky assures me that my transcripts remain sealed, which is why I went the more academic path at UNC Chapel Hill and studied political science. But I guess I want to just share a couple of thoughts if you don't leave with anything else. You've already heard one of the numbers, which is 48. I mean, North Carolina today is 48th in the country in per pupil spending. The other number is 46. And I suspect you know what that number is. That's where North Carolina ranks in average teacher salary. That's embarrassing. I mean, frankly. And you know, I will have to say I do agree with a couple of the comments that were made this morning by Representative Murray and Representative Stam. It didn't start 2 years ago. So, I mean, we all collectively own this now. And so the question is, what are we going to do, moving forward on it? But the idea that North Carolina, of all states, would be in this place, it's just hard for me being a native North Carolinian. I don't know how many are grew up here. How many are from North Carolina? That's most of you. I mean, I think that, I don't know. I guess growing up here, it was just kind of an article of faith that investing in education was good. It was something that we did. We invested in our public schools. We invested in our community colleges. We invested in our university system. We started the first state university in 1789. About 30 years later, we opened our first public school. That was 174 years ago. I know that only because I know the School Administrators Association is going to be celebrating the 175th anniversary of public school education in North Carolina in January. In Senator Phil Berger's district, actually, that school opened 175 years ago. And Philip mentioned the fact of how much money comes from the state. This crowd probably understands this, but just so you understand that one of the reasons why North Carolina has such a higher percentage than most other states, really dates back to the same thing I talked about, which is North Carolina has always invested in valued education. in the Great Depression, many schools across the United States closed their doors and didn't educate students because of funding and because of the economy. In North Carolina, the state made it a priority to invest in education, took over the largest percentage of funding for the schools away from the local districts and the counties to the legislature in order to fund public education, and not a single public school in North Carolina closed during the Great Depression, not a single one. And so at that time, you started seeing this the shift, in which we still have. That's why you often hear that if you spend any time at the legislature, you've probably heard this comment that we are 8th in the country in the percentage that is paid for by the state versus the locals. And that's a true fact. But I think it's a little bit misleading because the investment in our students continues to go down. I mentioned that we're 48th in the country. So I don't know that the fact that a larger percentage is paid for by the state because the teachers' salaries are paid for by the state, I'm not sure that's necessarily something that we ought to hang our hat on and say, well, we're doing a great job because we're paying more of it out of the state when we're still at the very bottom. In fact, if you're a student in North Carolina today in public schools, the only thing that really matters to you is that there are 47 other states who are spending more on their students than they are on you. I mean, that's where it's coming from. So that's one, I think, is just thinking about the overall history of North Carolina and where we spend. The other is that what we have tried to shine a light on is frankly the disservice that we do in our state, and it's something we've been grappling with for decades, is between low wealth and high wealth counties. Those numbers that I mentioned about where we rank nationally don't take into consideration the very poorest counties, which frankly are most of the counties. If you're not in the Piedmont, Charlotte, or the Triangle area, you tend to fall on that. It's particularly on eastern North Carolina, you're going to be in one of the lower wealth counties. Think about this local school finance study that I mentioned that we do. You can see all these numbers. Orange County is the #1 local investor in its students in North Carolina. They spend $4,183 per student just out of county dollars. Swain County spends $399. Matter of fact, if you take the bottom 7 counties of per pupil spending in North Carolina and add them all together, they're still less than how much Orange County spends. Now, our state constitution requires that we provide a sound and equal education to all of our students. It's kind of hard to imagine that we're really doing that when you have that big of a gap. In fact, I would say that it's not only that, it's actually getting worse. Right now, the higher wealth counties, which is we just released a study in January, the top 10 highest spending counties spend an average of $59,000 more per classroom than the lowest spending counties. And those dollars are what helps with supplemental pay for teachers. Those are things that help with resources in the classroom, that help with extra support for the students who need it. I would argue that we actually, the reverse really is true. Those poorest counties and those poorest students are the ones that actually need the additional resources, because they're the ones that are already entering school so far behind. I mean, I'm blessed to have grown up here, and my daughter, who's 13 now, grew up in Wake County. When she started kindergarten at Joyner Elementary here in Raleigh, she walked in, after already having 4 years of formal, preschool, 2-day 2s and 3-day 3s at Hayes Barton Methodist Church preschool. She bopped in with this, massive, monogrammed hair bow and her smock dress and all that, just, who could already read and write and knew how to, sit in a classroom and listen. But, I went to that first day of class with her. And there were a few other kids just like her, but then there were most of the other kids, there were kids that didn't know how to hold a crayon or use scissors. There were kids who came in tired with their underwear shoved in their back pocket. There were kids who came in who were having to translate English to their Spanish-speaking parent from the teacher, and we just sort of thrust them into that and expect that they're going to do just as well. And I felt sorry for that teacher, but she did a phenomenal job. And I mean, we can do better. And I think that we need to explore some alternative funding models that make sure that we invest in things that make a difference. I think if I had to point to one thing that, of all the things that you hear about where there are conflicting studies, like the master's pay and those kinds of things, early childhood and investing in pre-K is probably the one thing that there is really indisputable evidence that it makes a difference, and it makes a difference in that child being ready to learn and to keep up with their peers. And so I think if there was one thing that could help close that gap of what we're doing in those low wealth counties, it will be to continue to invest and expand on that. So thank you.
And to bring a local perspective, we'll turn it over now to Ricky Lopes.
Good afternoon. If I could piggyback on one of the comments that Keith made before I start with my notes, when he mentioned the disparity between the highest and the lowest, it wasn't that the lowest doesn't want to provide more, and they don't have the ability to provide more. The property tax base is so low in some of those counties, they can't tax themselves enough to even get close. And so within that study, you'll see also a county's effort. They've got the ability as one column and the effort as another. So you can see whether the county that you're in is putting what's considered to be a fair amount into public education based on the resources that they have available. But I use that every year. You go to that study and look at it pretty closely. But that's a very good study. I've been doing it for, I guess, 20 plus years now through the public school forum. But what I want to do is bring down the state level of funding down to Cumberland County. And then you can relate this to your own particular county. I did a little presentation for our board a couple months ago, and using the historical data from the 12-13 year that we finished June of 13, and going back to 2008, 2009, we would have needed $34 million of state money to be at the same point that we were at in 2008, 2009. $34 million. With the current budget that we just approved, we will have laid off over 600 positions in the last 5 years. Over 600 positions. Okay? You say, how in the world did you lose $34 million over the 5-year period? Well, there's one or two things that are not necessarily unique to Cumberland, but they don't pertain to every county. One is that we've lost the majority of our low wealth funds. Because of some intricacies in the formula, being a military community, we lost our low wealth funds. That was $8 million a year. We were able to get $2 million of it back, so even if you take that net, we've lost $6 million in low wealth money. We talked about flexibility. The flexibility provisions used to allow you to convert positions at the state average. That changed 2 years ago to where you can only use the beginning salary of a teacher. That was about a $12,000 to $13,000 per position difference when you're taking advantage of that limited flexibility that Philip was talking about. First of all, you don't have a lot of dollars anyway, and then we're taking advantage of the flexibility to try to maximize the use of those dollars, and $12,000 to $13,000 a position is taken away. Once again, that costs us about $4 to $5 million. So those two things wouldn't necessarily pertain to every county. The other two items would. One thing that's not mentioned sometimes when we talk about comparing the years is how much retirement and hospitalization have increased over the last 5 years. We have to pay a matching retirement percentage on all the eligible employees, and of course pay matching hospitalization insurance. So over a 5-year period, and these aren't exact figures, I'm just rounding them up, but we used to pay about 8% an employee for a retirement contribution. We're almost at 15% this year. So you're looking at almost 7% per person difference in the retirement contribution. Well, every dollar you pay for that takes away from dollars that you can use to pay for another position. So if you take that into consideration, that's part of that difference. So in other words, you'd have to have more dollars now to be at the same level you were 5 years ago. The other issue, obviously, is just the fact that state funding has decreased. And we don't have enough time to look at all the different categories we used to have in state appropriations that we don't have anymore, such as, staff development and things of that nature, mentors, things of that nature. But the state funding has also decreased. And once again, that's not something that's happened in the last year or two. This has happened over a 5-year period, so this isn't a political statement. But over that 5-year period in Cumberland County, we've lost the equivalent of $34 million. For us to get those 600 positions back and to put the other items that have been cut out of the budget, we would have needed $34 million more dollars. And so, you see different things that come out as to whether we're actually at the same level or not. You can't just look at the raw numbers. That's the point of what I'm trying to get across. You can't just look at the raw numbers. You have to look at what could you have bought with those same dollars 5 years ago versus what you're buying now. Just briefly, like Philip said, we could talk about finance all day, and just to give you a brief comments on some things that have already been mentioned, the lottery funds. There's probably not a week that goes by that somebody at the grocery store or somewhere wants to know why the lottery funds aren't taking care of the public schools. And there's a history to that, but the bottom line is all the lottery funds did, for the most part, except for the capital outlay part, they replaced general fund dollars. And so these commercials drive me crazy, and I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but when they say that we're getting all these additional teachers from the lottery funds, we're not getting additional teachers, we're just keeping the ones that we had. Okay? So, yes, it's going towards salaries, but we didn't pick up any additional teachers as a result of lottery funds since day one of the lottery. Okay? Talk about capital funds for a second. There used to be a set-aside fund at the state level called the Public School Capital Fund that was used to help schools with capital outlay expenditures. In Cumberland County, the last full year of funding, we received about $4 million out of that. They took that away when they started the lottery. Okay, we were supposed to get $7 million a year from the lottery. This year we'll get $3.5 million from the lottery for capital outlay. So we gave up $4 million to get 3.5, but we're getting all this extra money from the lottery. Okay, so that's my political statement. That's it. So anyway, when you see these commercials about the lottery, just take it with a grain of salt. But getting back to the local level, just using Cumberland County as an example, being in a military community, we have a lot of property that's not taxable. So I think the latest study shows that we're 88th out of 100 counties in the state with the ability to tax, because our property tax base per student is very low. And if you look at that chart, as Keith mentioned, most of those counties are in north and southeastern North Carolina, if you look at the bottom of those charts. Well, our tax rate is well above what is supposed to be the rate for a system with our demographics. So the county is doing what they think is their fair share to help us with the local part of funding. So when you're relying on the state at 62%, what we didn't mention is that used to be over 70%. When I first was in school finance, but I started back in 1985, and I don't remember the exact number, but I believe it was over 70%, and so now it's down to 62. Well, that's your biggest source of funding, and it goes down. You can't replace that dollar for dollar with local funds. Okay, so every little bit of that you lose at the state level is probably not going to be replaced by the local dollars. And I would say there's probably, even though we were using the extremities as far as funding, I would say there's probably not what we would call a rich system in North Carolina. I don't think anybody gets too much money. But I also don't think that you can just throw money at everything and think that's going to take care of the problem. But there is a baseline that we all should have that we should be able to work from, and I fear that we don't have that baseline. One thing that is facing some of the units this upcoming years that I'm seeing, I do a little bit of work on the side, working with other school systems and some finance officers. You've heard the term fund balance. At the local level, school systems will have what's called a fund balance. That's like the reserve, the savings account of local money. And a lot of those systems are using that fund balance to make up for the state cuts. What they're not doing is implementing a plan as to how to phase out that reliance on the fund balance. If you have $30,000 in your savings account and you go buy a car for $25,000 with that money, you now have $5,000 left. You can't buy a $25,000 car next year with those funds because you've only got $5,000. Well, you use that same logic with the fund balance. Schools are using a good portion of that to get them through, let's say, the 14-15 year that's coming up, but they won't have those dollars available for 15-16. So what does that mean? If they don't get those dollars from somewhere else, they're going to have to make major cuts. And I already know of a handful of systems that are going through that for their 14-15 budget because the fund balance is running out. So you'll hear that term fund balance from time to time that the local units are using to try to get through their budget. But for the sake of time, as I said, we could talk about finance all afternoon, and it wouldn't be exciting to y'all. It might be to some of us, but it wouldn't be exciting to y'all. But I appreciate y'all coming and listening to us, and I'll turn it back over to Mike. Thank you.
I just want to say for the record that the lottery bill did not pass until the year after I left. On the issue of per pupil expenditure, I wanted to mention one other thing, and that is that while per pupil expenditure as a comparison among school districts and between schools probably is not a real great, not a real useful comparative statistic. Per pupil expenditure state to state is a very useful statistic. It's a statistic that has very significant meaning at the macro level. So at this time, we want to turn it over to you for questions. And I was told to invite questions, not editorials. When you, if you have a question, if you will, come down to the microphone, and let's see what questions or comments we have. I mean, questions only.
So I'm Helen or Sunny Ladd from Duke University. Philip, this is a question for you. Could you explain to us very clearly and simply how the funding works for charter schools, which are their own separate districts?
Do you want me to talk here or?
Yeah, or you got, there you go.
As Dr. Ladd knows, I can't do anything succinctly or shortly, so I'll give it my best shot. Charter schools are funded in a lump sum amount based on you take all the state allotments to a particular school district and you convert them to dollars. So all the position allotments are then multiplied times the average salary for teachers in the school district, and you add that all up and you got a total amount of money that the LEA receives from the state. You divide that by the student population, and that comes up to $1 per student. That is then multiplied times the students that are attending the charter school, and then they receive that amount of money to operate. They receive supplemental funds. See, part of the problem is they don't get all the categorical allotment, dollar allotment, and position allotments, but they do get the categorical allotments for children with special needs. That's a separate allotment based on their specific head counts, and they get separate money for LEP. But generally speaking, they get all their money in one pot that they then utilize to meet the needs of their particular population.
Can I ask one minor follow-up? Is there a cap on the special needs part on the charter school? So the charter school has more than 13% of its students in special needs, and the amount they get capped?
I'm going to repeat the question because we're being videotaped. Is there a cap on the categorical funding? And you mentioned in particular funding as an example for special needs learners.
The charter schools are incorporated within the local school district to come up with the total population of the county that's eligible for children with special needs. That is capped in the state funding formula at 12.5%. Which means that if a charter school, if the entire school district county has more students than 12.5% incorporating the charter school, then they will get reduced down to be at the same level as the school district. So they're not funded separately for EC funding, but they do add to the calculation of the 12.5% state cap.
Other questions? Yes, please come on up.
Sorry.
I'm wondering if folks could illuminate a little bit on how much we spend on standardized testing, including if we were to put in the amount of money we spend in staff time for standardized testing.
The state funding for the accountability operation, I believe, is around $6 million. We also receive a federal grant funding that comes in that pretty much doubles that amount. So there's about $12 million in the annual operating budget associated with assessment, which is your end of grade, end of course. Test, I do not have the ability to convert the number of people associated with the assessment process, because that then comes as formative and summative definition. And obviously, there's a lot of people involved in the evaluation of our students' performances based on each standard that they're trying to take. So there's probably a great deal of the state public school fund that's associated with the continuing evaluation of students. But the money I can answer, which is approximately $12 million state and federal.
From a local perspective, for instance, in Cumberland County, we have an assessment department, to be able to analyze all the test data and so forth. But on a school-by-school basis, there's a lot of folks that are involved in the testing process, so it's part of their base salary, but it's not a standalone. So as Philip was saying, we wouldn't be able to determine exactly how much is spent on testing. We do have printing costs for the test that we distribute out to the schools. If the state's not picking it up, then of course we have to pick it up. So there are some additional costs, but as far as being able to quantify that, it'd be pretty difficult in that we don't have a standalone testing function that has its own salary for each of those positions at the school-based level.
And I probably need to, we do get funded from the General Assembly for things like the ACT, which is a separate pot of money. That is an assessment, I believe that's around $8 million. And I might have understated the appropriation, the state appropriation, it could be a couple of million more. But in total, if you look at the state funding that comes to the department that we then turn around and build our test on, it is probably around $16 million in total. And the federal money is coming in around $6. So that's the total amount of funding out of the state $8 billion state public school fund that's directly funded for that.
Next question.
Just a quick one that would be of particular interest, I think, to people here from Wake County. You mentioned the measurement of the level of effort by counties. I know last time I looked, Wake County was in the bottom quartile in terms of our tax rate, way down there, way behind the other urban school districts. But I don't know what the level of effort is. I'd be very curious to know what that, if you have that information.
I do, and I'll see if I can dig it out while I'm talking. And I'm glad that Ricky mentioned, this gives me a chance to sort of, I didn't footnote it the way he did, but he's absolutely right. The local school finance report absolutely is not meant to throw rocks at the low-wealth counties for what they're spending, because as a matter of fact, they are actually taxing at a higher rate, sometimes 40% higher than what we're taxing in the higher wealth counties, but because it's all based on property values, and so these counties just don't have the property value base to tax on. And, I think that, frankly, I think the Wake County question is an excellent question, because you look at a county like Wake. I'm looking to see if I can find where we're ranked. Actual effort and ability to pay. See, actual effort, Wake ranks 28th out of 100 counties in actual effort. I mean, obviously we have, that's compared to Mecklenburg at 22, is compared to Durham County at 5th, Orange County at 2nd. So if you're looking at some of the Guilford County is also higher. I mean, I think that's. It's hard to look at it, and I think you need to look at it in total, because I think it's pretty clear that a county like Wake County, for example, there is revenue potential that we're not getting, that we are not asking our residents to pay to support our schools. And look, the issue of low wealth and poverty is not just an Eastern North Carolina thing either. I mean, look, we have children in poverty who need additional investment in things like pre-kindergarten, not just in Eastern North Carolina, but in Eastern Wake County and in Eastern Durham County too. So I think that's. I'll find it. I'll find you afterwards before I find it. But I would just have to say that Wake County definitely falls somewhere in the middle in terms of what we could do versus what we actually do in terms of additional investment. But Wake County still has the ability, because of those resources, to give more supplemental pay, target more supplemental pay for teachers. It actually, even with all the teacher turnover problems that we have right here in the Triangle area, they're far worse, and they're going to get worse in the poorer counties as the teachers flock to the counties that can actually afford to pay them.
Final question.
Jessica Holmes, so you mentioned the significance of the property tax base. So when you look at Orange County and the difference between Swain County, how or is the state addressing this discrepancy?
The low wealth supplemental funding allotment is designed to look at the difference between what a county should be able to generate for public schools and what the actual formula, what they're actually contributing. The formula says they should contribute compared to what they are contributing, and it makes up the difference between the 2 times their average daily membership, sort of. In Swain County, you have other issues with government land that brings in money called impact aid. That does not come through the state. It comes directly to the county or the school district in that region. But the state funding formula is the only one that is driven off of that differential is the low wealth supplemental allotment, which I believe in the handout it does outline that funding stream is somewhere around $212.5 million of supplemental money, but it does go out based on that percentage difference. For example, if you're close to the state average, you're not going to get very much money. As Ricky was talking about, his funding had dropped dramatically. But it's the further you're away, like Robinson County, they generate quite a significant amount of state funding in the low wealth allotment. Swain being a small school district, they do not, actually.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly mention the low wealth supplemental pay, Title I funding from the federal government also helps, with the poorer counties. But again, it still doesn't make up the, the big. I mean, that's where there are other funding models. There are other states that look at it differently. There are those states that are looking at, Mike made a point of the, tracking per pupil spending. It's a good way to compare state to state, but that's not really how we fund schools. We actually fund them by staff positions. And so the funding is actually, you look at how many students and then you are allocated money based on the number of teachers or the number of positions. Some states are looking at student-based funding and looking at how many kids you have and looking at their relative need and making the decision how much you invest there. I mean, I think that's something we ought to look at. I mean, because again, it gets more to the issue of what do you actually need to do to deliver to those kids versus just looking at some, formula based on the number of teachers or number of adult professionals in the school.
In addition to understanding accountability for funding, they also understand accountability for time, and we're finishing right on time. I'd like for you all to join me in thanking this panel.